Technology. There we go. Great. Okay, so the Burgess family, freedom pioneers for justice, equality, succeeding generations, and paving the way for those behind us. This is part two. For those of you that didn't get a chance to watch part one, Matthew did it last week, but I encourage you to go back and watch the video. So I'm going to talk about really the Burgess family in Coloma and some missing pieces of history that we have come to find really very, very interesting. And so this is part two of the presentation for Coloma, California, and the Burgess family as original pioneers. So I'll just kind of dive right in and give you a background. Tonight we're going to be talking about, I like to say the basically 5 men of the hour or the half hour. That's what I have. And if you see, from left to right, that is Elder Burgess. We've established that. He left his autobiography. That's what our family's got so much history from. Rufus M Burgess, our great-grandfather. So we go great-great-grandfather, great-grandfather. That's our great-uncle Marion, our Uncle Todd, and our grandfather, Rufus M Burgess. And these are the gentlemen you'll hear about mainly tonight. And we're going to take you back into pretty much history in Coloma. What we found in doing our own history is that Coloma talks about a time of 1850, which is the gold rush, and 1855-ish, and then it loses a block of history. It loses about 25 years of what happens, and then Coloma comes back and they tell you about things that happened once things were desegregated. It's not that it went away. A lot of things happened, and I think you'll be amazed and actually honored to hear what happened during that 25-year span. And the Burgess family, along with the Gooch and the Monroes, were instrumental in kind of shaping that era to become what it is today. But very important part of history, so take notes, and just happy to share with you guys. So I'll start off with, in 1850, basically, we talk about Coloma, and this is an autobiography or escapade of Reverend Kip. And so what you have, Kip, is commissioned to go to Coloma in 1854. A gentleman writes him and wants to start a Methodist church. And so he travels to Coloma the next year in 1855. And when he talks about going there, he actually mentions the orchards. He mentions the beautiful hillsides, just everything that the valley has, everything that it has. And so the interesting about, he talks about when he first gets there, there's about 600 to 700 people in Coloma proper. And this is where most people talk about, most people know about the gold rush. And there were 600 or 700 people. He went out because a gentleman said they wanted to start a church. So he goes out, he talks about the orchards, the valleys as he travels. And so the next slide is going to pretty much just be a map. And this is a stock photo that's here, and it just kind of shows the hillside and the valley. But what I want to mention is, the normal route of travel during the gold rush would have been from Sacramento coming up. And so you would pass, what's known as Negro Bar, Mormon Island, all those areas on the way to Coloma. So you see this area right here, and this is Lower Main Street. Well, what most people don't talk about, or what you don't know about, last week we established that Elder Burgess, his home was right here. But during the initial gold rush, Coloma was segregated. A lot of pioneers came over from the south with their slaves. Some of the slaves, like we said, weren't freed wide away. They actually worked in the fields and the mines for their owners. And what I want to really hit on is that the nicer part of Coloma was right in here along Main Street. Well, if you learn any history and you looked at the parks, they talk about the Wilsons, the Burgesses, the DeLorean, and the Julian properties. And other than Elder Burgess, who lived right here, yeah, everybody else lived at the other part of the town. So it was very segregated. Sorry about that. It was very segregated during those early days. In fact, so segregated that there was a church. William Kip comes back, he goes in 1854, says there's 600 to 700 people. He comes back a year later to check on a church. They had a building, and the Methodist church. Well, if I go back to the map, I want to show you guys something on the map. So Kip comes back to really set up a church. And when he comes back the next year, he talks about something. He talks about when he looks off to the right-hand side as he enters the town, he sees a little Negro Methodist church, which quite frankly, there was. As you know, if you know African American history, we always, that was a big part of slavery. But when you look here, Kip talked about all the orchards. So there are a number of orchards here. There's Emmanuel Church here and H.B. Pierce property. Now, what I want people to know about, there's a Methodist church here where my cursor is. This Methodist church actually burned down in 1849 or 51, between that date. And this is a parsonage. So there was an actual Methodist church. The town was very segregated, where you had, again, the initial slaves lived down here, and then everybody else was in the main part of the town. Well, when Kip returns for his second visit, he talks about the town that mines had petered out in 1856. And although he returned to commence the church, when he gets there, they hold services in the courtyard. The next day he stays for about a few hours, and he basically talks about, he arranged for where things would go in the church. But he never had service in the church, which I thought was very, very interesting. He also mentions that in 1856, the mines had petered out. And for those of you that don't know, in 1856, the county seat, which was all the voting, moved to Placerville. Kip says in his escapade, and I encourage you to read it, that the good people moved to Placerville, the majority of them. He also says that the Methodists that remained there, he uses some terms and pretty derogatory towards the Methodists that were there. So I don't know if they were a mixture of black and white, but they weren't good terms that he mentioned about them. But basically what he says is that they could barely hold conversations and didn't have patience. And so in 1857, Church for the Methodists actually left the Emmanuel building, and they said for disrepair. And that was from another book, Upton's book. It left the Emmanuel Church, and they were holding services in the Oddfellows Hall in 1857. Now, I asked why that was. This next slide here is just a picture of Upton's book, and this is 1850 to 1940. And Upton actually talks about, at the bottom here, there was a Negro Methodist church at Coloma in the early days. Now, between Kip and Upton, the early days we classify as pretty much 1850 to 1855, maybe 60 tops, but 1855. So I do believe, in fact, there was a Methodist church, a Negro church in the early days. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of move forward. But this slide is in here just to kind of set the tone of what was going on in 1852. Now, we know that Elder Burgess was there in 1852. The Gooches were there in 1852. And Rufus M Burgess was there in 1852. This right here is Elias Willer House. And if you guys go to Coloma today, it's still interpreted. And this is along the upper part of Main Street where the nicer homes existed. This is an African-American man with a horse and carriage. Mr. Willer came to Coloma in 1852. Says he opened up a store near his house, which was not uncommon. That's what people did. And as we talk about the blacksmith shop and some of the things that the Burgess family owns, it would just make sense. But this is merely here just to show you the differences. There's some oral narrative about how the early pioneers lived, the black folks primarily. And when they did oral narratives about 1880 or 1900, it talks about some of the conditions were terrible. One actually references the former Burgess home, which, again, Rufus M, I don't believe he lived right up in Main Street. But this slide goes to Nelson Bell, Elder Burgess. I'll call him Elder Burgess. We saw this last week. So we questioned, well, was there a Methodist church? Was there an early Negro church? Yes, in fact, there was. From his handwritten autobiography that's been in our family for over 170 years, it was in his Bible, passed on from generation to generation. He talks about finding the church at the early age of 20. And then always church being, even up on his death, he talks about how, the glory of God liveth forever, even though man had wronged him during his life. And so he had the means. He not only had the means, but he had the connections to ensure that there was a church. And so when you go to Coloma today, they tell you, well, the Burgesses and the Monroes had a little lane that led to the church in between their houses, down where all the blacks lived. And that may have very well been true during the early days. But as you saw back in the book that Upton wrote, and I encourage you to read it, the early days ended at 1855, no more than 1860. So there was, in fact, something there. And I would imagine that based on what he did, because there was segregation, and hey, let's face it, Kip was commissioned to come and start the Methodist Church. Before we go to that slide, so Kip was commissioned to come and start the Methodist Church. But what I will say about the Methodist Church is the word Emmanuel, for those of us that don't know, that word originated in 1818, around that year in South Carolina. And it had to do with African Americans that wanted to worship Christianity. And so the Emmanuel Church was built in 1855. Well, started in 1855, completed in 1856. And services for the Methodists, obviously they had a building across the street, which again, if you look at Coloma and how it was set up, well, there's some segregation that existed there. And I can appreciate the state of California to want to have an inclusive California and show Coloma how it's very inclusive. But during this 25-year timeline and the gold rush, it was very segregated. And Elder Burgess, as you can look at his features, he was fair-skinned. He learned to read and write because he was raised in the house of his master. So there was a privilege extended to him, which, hey, that's probably why we have this information today and why Rufus M and others were so successful. This next slide here is Dr. Paul Nesbitt, which he's not the first time you'll see him in this presentation. But Dr. Nesbitt actually, what he did is he talks about the existence of an African church, the AME Church, in Coloma. And this is a memo in 1997 written to Mr. Sugarman, the late Matt Sugarman of the park, indicating that there was in fact an African church. Now, what African American history will tell you about the African church, during the year of 1863, the colored citizens movement, whatever you call it, schools were segregated. And the church for African Americans the AME Church was going to be the vehicle to teach the children. Now, in our last episode, Tina Alexander mentioned that there were 172 landowners, African American, in 1869 in El Dorado County. And so, although Coloma talks about the 5 black families that were there, the Gooches, the Monroes, the Burgesses, the Wilsons, the Delores, and potentially the Julian properties, there were more African American families in Coloma prior to the gold rush, during the gold rush, and today it's kind of dwindled down to, very few, if any at all. But the significance of this document is really just showing that there was an AME church in Coloma. Jacob Johnston actually deeded it in 1863 to the AME Board of Trustees, and that's what Dr. Nesbitt says here as he's telling the late Matt Sugarman that, hey, this was the case. There's some other information in here, but we'll get to that later. And here's a picture just down below of the church. So as you can see, the church, the Emmanuel Church, again, I said, built in 1855, finished in 1856. You notice all the orchards around it. And Reverend Kip actually talked about all the orchards and the vineyards. And so in Gold Rush history, we'd never talk about, well, what were the people eating? I've never heard it. Maybe we do talk about it. But the valley was rich with orchards. And it had agriculture. In fact, it said that Rufus Burgess, it's written, I didn't write it, Rufus Burgess terraced the hillside across from where gold was discovered. Well, a lot of former slaves, that's what they did. They farmed land. And so it's interesting to see that, Emmanuel Church was also, the location of it was on the map of 1857, the H.B. Pierce property. Now, what's interesting about H.B. Pierce is that for a man or a person to have that much property and wealth, there's very little written about him. And in my studies, it's shown 2 things in history. When you have that much written about you, you have that little written about you, you have a lot of property and potential of wealth. Either you're African American, as in it's hard to find African American history, we have to dig for it, or you were a white abolitionist that was for African Americans. And so what we know about H.B. Pierce is that he was a gardener. He had a son, I believe, Henry Pierce, but pay attention to that name and how it was spelled, how it's spelled, because it'll come to play later. So as we're talking about the church, I want to inform you that Reverend Jennifer, and this actually basically this is the same thing that I believe Nesbitt was saying, but in 1863, Reverend John Thomas Jennifer, and this came from the Colored Citizens Minutes, African American Minutes, was commissioned and came to Sacramento. He was appointed to Placerville Circuit, and on one of his preaching points, Coloma was one of the 5 or 6 preaching points. So he spent time in Coloma actually preaching. And I know on a prior call, people in Placerville said they didn't know that there was actually an AME church in Placerville. And I think Upton's book even talks about it. There was an AME church in Placerville, and it was Reverend Jennifer that actually built it. This document says exactly what he did, and it was left with only $80 in debt. Unfortunately, that church was burned down sometime. I don't know if it made it until the 1900 fires or if it was burned down, shortly, after he left, but it never made it. And it's interesting that, again, many people in Placerville today don't know that there was a church there. So as we go, 1863, we established that, the church was going to be the teaching mechanism for the children in Coloma. The schools were, in fact, segregated, and so there was a need and a reason for the church to be there. And we believe it was the Emmanuel Church. That's the church, and the reason we believe it was the Emmanuel Church is, like I said, in 1857, the Methodists were meeting in the Oddfellows Hall when there was a perfectly fine Emmanuel Church. And I asked the question, why? Maybe somebody on the call knows. So this is a document and a letter from actually Marilyn Dimash. She's a historian, decorated historian, and she actually wrote the parks. And there was a Matthew or Mike Minnick. Anyway, she's indicating to him that in doing some studies, she found the colored citizen minutes of this church in Coloma. And in this document, she tells exactly where to find the information. Not only did she find the information, she found that there were a total of seven members that were assigned to this church. Or the church had 7 members, and so I assume it was probably the Burgess family, the Gooch family, because the Monroes haven't made it over yet, the Delores, and maybe the Wilsons. But anyhow, there were 7 members of this church. But she indicates that hundreds of people would come around during the year or during Sundays for services. And although there were only 7 members, hundreds would attend services, and that the building was a comfortable building. And she also indicates that the people of the town wanted a school for their kids. Now, again, this was sent to State Parks, was made aware of this in 2006. What they chose to do with it, I have no idea. Hopefully, Mr. Hilton can comment when I'm done, or we can do some question and answers. I'm sure a lot of you will have questions as to why this hasn't been brought forward. So my next slide, if we go back to what was going on in 1863, well, 1864, this is African American newspaper. It's called the Pacific Appeal. That's Rufus M Burgess, our great-grandfather, and he was actually assigned as the agent for the newspaper. And the agent was responsible for ensuring that it's distributed to the other members in the town. There's a $5 subscription fee for the paper. I read this edition, absolutely amazed at what they were talking about. So the Civil War hadn't yet ended, but they were talking about the secret society, which we know there's one because we've got the ring of the Pythias Knights of our great-grandfather. It was talking about the secret society if you needed help. It talked about their brothers and sisters in the South. It also talked about making sure that your children are educated in the trades and mechanics and also in the trades. But I thought, here's what was most interesting about what this document talked about. It really talked about the homestead. It said, educate yourselves on the homestead law or the Homestead Act that's coming. And so what you have here is a paper that ran for about 20 years, all African Americans, and they're sharing information. They've been talking about, pastors, Methodist pastors or preachers that were arrested and had nothing to hold them on, no reason for them to be arrested. So when I look at this, I'm really proud to know this has existed. I don't know if a lot of people knew about it, but Rufus M Burgess was actually one of the contributors regularly. He was writing to San Francisco. This paper was out of San Francisco, talking about civil rights. And there were a number of people that contributed to it. So I encourage you to look it up. It's available. But look at it. But this is what was going on in Coloma 1864. So that's a year after the AME Church was established. And I'm sure, I know Rufus M had everything to do with it, which we'll find out here shortly. So the end of an era, which was very sad, but understandable. You know, this is Elder Burgess, and he was buried under his slave name. Now, this is the autobiography that's existed in our family for years. The state of California, and I'll make one correction. I think Tina Alexander mentioned last week. I do want to correct and say that he didn't have 600 acres. He had $600 and some amount of real estate, and said he had no heirs upon his death. And so this is the tombstone that exists. But I do ask this question, and maybe Steve can answer it or somebody else. In 1869, you know, I think the Civil War was over. We were homesteading property. Why was the state of California interested in coming and take land from Elder Burgess? Well, Nelson Bell. We were giving land away in the sums, and as far as I know, deeds weren't even given out yet. But the state of California knew, and there were other people within the state, Robert Chalmers, you'll see him come up on the map, that I believe also knew about Elder Burgess. And so people ask, well, why was he buried under a slave name? Or why wouldn't somebody come forth and say, why wouldn't Rufus M come forth and say, hey, that's my father? Well, there was a privilege, as I mentioned, for him being who he was and fair-skinned. And I don't know why Rufus M, but I would just say that the times weren't right for that. But I will say this, you know, you've got Nancy and Peter Gooch, and you've got Andrew Monroe. Bill brought him over. He writes, if you saw his writing last week, it's very eloquent. He knows who he was, who he came from. And our family was told, your great-great-grandfather wanted his people to know where they came from and who they were. So that narrative lives. It will be until somebody can tell me different. So this is the first township map of Coloma, and it was done in 1873. Unfortunately, this is a replicated copy of the actual map. So a couple things I'll point out on this map. It was done in 1873. This is actually at the county surveyor's office today. And you probably can't see here, but if you blow it up, this right here is lot 1, block 6. And when you read books today, that was where the Grange Hall sat. That was actually Elder Burgess's blacksmith shop. But the name here is Robert Chalmers. And that's why I said earlier, Robert Chalmers knew who Elder Burgess was, because not only does he show up here, well, if you look across the street, well, this was the Elder Burgess property that was on the map. No longer is his name there. And when you come around the church, you'll see some other things. But the only other thing I'll point out on this map is, this is very obvious, is that every other block and lot is mentioned here, except for block 7. If you look here, and when you look blocks, my understanding of real estate and lots and blocks, I've studied them, they go from left to right. So with, you know, the lowest numbers starting on the right and going up, when you come to block 7, it's all messed up. And it's unfortunate. But I asked the surveyor's office, hey, if this is a replicated copy, it was done the same year that the original copy was done. Where's the original? They don't have it. So I say this is kind of where things really started to go shaky a little bit. But there are always good people in history, and there always have been. This next slide is Judge Charles Ingram. Well, this isn't Judge Ingram. Judge Charles Irwin basically was commissioned. I don't know if he was federal or state, but as people were living on the land, and you had a lot of African Americans that were living on the land. And let me back up and correct something. So I mentioned that in 1855, the mines had petered out. 1856, people moved to Placerville. It was mentioned that the land was left to the Negroes and Chinese. That's oral narrative. People were not, you know, if the land was left to the Negroes and Chinese, well, they naturally gravitated to where they wanted to go. And unlike today, when you were with homesteads, you were living on a property and then you got your deeds later. So Irwin was actually commissioned to hand out deeds, and a lot of the people had been living here, like Rufus M was already living on property. This actually is a picture of George Ingram. And I've got the Emmanuel Church in the middle, because that is of a lot of significance right now. So I blow this up again and I talk about the maps, and you can see a little bit more of how these maps are laid out. Unfortunately, this map of 1873, even though Rufus M was here and a number of other people, this map doesn't have one African American listed on it. Not uncommon for the times, but it should have been. So I want to give you a little bit of history about Mr. Ingram. he was an attorney and a tax collector. In 1872, he bought what he called the African Church. Now, he named it the African Church, but it was Lot 3, Block 7. It says that Mr. Ingham was one of the most well-respected people, honest. He was a member of the Masonic Order, and all of our grandfathers were. And what he did when he bought Lot 3, Block 7, it actually occurred in 1872, prior to the map being done. And this is the actual deed. And it says it was a convergence of real estate. It was bought for back taxes. Now, it's our belief that he bought the African Church, which was a manual church. Rufus M, knowing that nobody would ever believe that an African-American man owned the church, that the guy that discovered gold had his funeral services in, not only took this deed, and I believe his privileges of being a Mason allowed him to do it. He not only took this deed, folded it, and put it in the family, he took the deed when he bought the land back. He buys it back 3 months later. But when he buys it back, before he buys it back, he bought Lot 4, which we assume was his house, and then he bought Lot 3, Block 7. Now, this is the actual deed. The family has it today, and it reads, it doesn't read African Church in here, but it's Lot 3, Block 7. And what it says is all the real property within the surveyed lines of the field notes of the township of Coloma. As I mentioned to you prior, the field notes were left out of the replicated copy of the map of 1873. So how do we prove that that church was actually the church? Well, Rufus knew that nobody would ever believe it. We know now that that's where the children were being educated. And it wasn't until later that they desegregated the schools and they made it more inclusive. But if I go on through the timeline of 1879 to 1885, unfortunately, you got to the left, there's a picture of Nancy and Peter Gooch. And the Gooch family, the Monroe family, and the Burgess family, they were working together. And it made sense. If you look at all the agriculture that was here. Elder Burgess only had one son, maybe others. The park may have some documents we don't have. But as far as we know, only one that came over, and that was Rufus M. Rufus M didn't have kids, our uncles, great uncles and grandfather, until the late 1800s and 1890. But Nancy and Peter were here. And what I do know about African American history is all slaves have the same struggle, they work together. And so it would benefit, not only did he have the means because of the newspaper, because of the secret society, and now Peter has actually died. He died in 1861. So how did Nancy get the kids over here? Well, you'll hear stories about the Burgess and the Monroes quarreling over a lane that led to the colored church. Well, if that's the case, the Monroes didn't get here until 1879, and the church is situated where there is a lane to it. But the Burgesses and the Gooches, yeah, they praised an early day church, and they worked together because there was a lot of land that Rufus M acquired as he was here. In fact, he acquired so much land that it was actually, I read deeds where he's allowing people to live in the land until they died. So he was sharecropping. Incredible. So when Andrew Monroe gets over in 1879, I did an aerial map. These coordinates are actually correct. If you look here, and if you know the township of Coloma, this is what Andrew Monroe got. And if you go all the way up here, this is that lower part of Main Street where all the African Americans lived when they first came in with their slaves and they weren't segregated. But I asked, why didn't the Monroes buy anything? And I actually even studied when Pearlie Monroe, who was an incredible man. In fact, our grandfather used to go and visit Pearlie before our grandfather passed away, unfortunately, before Pearlie. But when I studied what Pearlie Monroe was doing, he never bought in Block 7. All his purchases were across the street where the school was, everywhere else, but he never bought Block 7. Why was that? Well, it's simply because the Burgesses and the Monroes were working together. They had to. So as we go to 1886, well, and I'll mention that in 1885, the funeral services for James Marshall happened. James Marshall died, and if you look at the map, which I'll show you later, basically his cabin wasn't too far from the church, and Andrew Monroe dug his grave for $10, and that's written, that's documented. So why was Marshall, if anybody knows history, Marshall was really upset and angry and felt that he was owed something because he discovered gold. He may have moved to other places. It says he bought 15 acres of orchards and some other things, but he stayed amongst the people that were there that were left in the town. So in 1886, we've got the Burgess family pretty much, and I don't know when my great uncle Marion, this is Marion here, this is my uncle Todd. Sorry about that. Yeah. There's Marion, oops. Marion, Todd, and that's our grandfather Rufus and our father. Those are the three men, you know, the offspring of Rufus M Burgess. So we fast forward to 1997. This is another document from Dr. Paul Nesbitt. And he says that he basically tells the Parks that, and I believe Nesbitt was a true historian because he worked for 23 years. But, you know, he's telling the Parks about the maps of 1873 are incorrect. And again, it's another document to Sugarman. And he's talking about the church again. He outlined some information, but unfortunately, his documentation kind of fell on deaf ears. I've got us. I'll sync here. Sorry about that, you guys. There we go. Okay. I'll reset here. So, Marion, Rufus, Todd. So, what I want to point out on this slide is that Anna Butler came over with Rufus M. Anna was bare with Rufus M. and said it was his wife. We believe as a family, Anna Butler was actually Elder Burgess's wife, and she came over with Rufus, her son. Just because there was a 20-year age gap. Maybe she died earlier. Hopefully there's some other information. We do know, though, that Stephanie was the mother to Todd and Marion, and Josephine, who actually goes by C.J. Pierce, was a mother to Rufus. And if you look at Pierce, she ran by the name Carolyn Josephine Pierce. And it's actually spelled the same way as H.B. Pierce. We just don't know the connection. So when you look down here at the Manual Church, you see H.B. Pierce, you see the church, you see all the orchards. So Josephine had something to do with Mr. Pierce before she ever married her great-grandfather, and that wouldn't have been until 1893. Our grandfather was born in 1896, but when she married him, she brought in 3 young boys, 2 other young boys. Now these are orchards. These are actually H.B. Pierce, 1856. And I'm going back in time a little bit, but just to show, this was a Mountain Democrat, and these are fruit trees from the orchards. And again, I told you, Coloma was full of agriculture. And so this represents Elder Burgess, this represents the Gooches, and Rufus M. And also, this signifies really the Monroe clan that came over to help manage all this. Now, this is a fruit voucher. 1885, Rufus M. came down to Sacramento and sold peaches. Okay, he sold peaches to a W.R. Strong company for about $61. And if you know what land was going for in 1885, it was about $3 to $5 an acre. So that's a substantial amount of fruit. And you ask, well, where's that coming from? And of course, he's aging. He's an older man now. 1885. He died in 1900. So it was probably of great benefit to get the Monroe and the Gooch family over here to help out. And of course, when he dies, that's the beginning of the end. On the left, you look, and this is his original headstone. And in 2005, my mother, being the backbone and learning more about history than we do, actually put NB in here instead of the M. And she put NB in there to basically let everybody know that we knew who Nelson Bell was, because that was the Bible that we carried in the family, with his handwritten autobiography. So what Josephine do? Her husband passes away in 1900. She's got 3 young boys. She sold 1 parcel of land. When I did the research, I was hoping that she didn't sell the farm. But she sold 1 parcel of land to Mr. Gallagher, and it was actually a farm. Now, these just represent deeds because we have all the deeds that Rufus ever did with the land. This house here is uninterpreted. We're hoping that somebody may know, but if you look at it, it looks very similar to what they call as the Monroe property. Maybe not, but this is uninterpreted. We believe it may have been one of the Burgess properties. So Josephine, she's got 3 young boys. She sold the farm, and in 1910, basically, William Monroe, one of the Monroe people, they unite and they marry. And William Monroe's, before they married, he's listed as a boarder in the Burgess home, which again may have been some of the confusion. This horse here is a picture of our grandfather on the horse. We dated him about 9 years old or so, just showing the land. But as we move on to present day or getting closer to the end, 1916, you see that's our great uncle Marion. They did an oral narrative. He would drive the Pierce engine, delivering fruit throughout Coloma, Sacramento, Placerville. Our grandfather upped his age and went off to the war. I believe Todd was down in Sacramento as a mechanic. And towards the end, we have this. You got Rufus, that's a picture of him. This picture used to actually hang in the blacksmith shop. This portrait was given to him to give to his wife. Josephine knew she would not know who her daughter was. She wouldn't live long enough. And it's an inscribed picture. It says, "To my dearest beloved daughter, with my love, wish may she carry the name Joe." This went to our grandmother, and it stayed in the family. And so she knew she didn't have much longer to live, and she probably wouldn't see him married off. She was Rufus M was the only real son of Josephine, bloodborn. The other two were her sons as well, but bloodborn. But what I'll mention here is that she did, because she married William Monroe, she signed a deed off to the boys in 1950, and she sold 3 parcels of land to them. And it said to hold. We have that deed today. Rufus M did exactly what he was supposed to do. He held the deed till 1921 when she died, came back and recorded it. And sadly, El Dorado County said they had no record of it. So we asked, well, how did the church go back to the state or wherever it went to? Here's a document that says in 1921, Josephine dies. The Manual Church, this document says that it was repossessed from the original owners because it wasn't used for what it was intended to use. And I believe this picture, I'm not sure where I found it, but it's a stock photo. This would be Lower Main Street as you kind of just enter the town. And I think these are like officer cars, but this was the beginning of the end as far as, well, the town was taken back. For the most part, a lot of the African Americans that were still there were pushed farther down, either Sacramento. Not sure if even Negro Bar was still in operation, but this was the beginning of the end. So this is the Burgess family today. Here we are. I'm here showing the parks discrepancies on maps, what we believe to be true, showing them documents. After so many years, we finally got them to recognize that Rufus owned the blacksmith shop, although it was written in this document. They still won't put that he was a landowner, even with Lot 3, Block 7. And more importantly, the Manual Church, we still think, well, it's actually ours, or we owned it at one point, and it would be great to actually show that. But here's a document, too, of the maps. Again, this is something that I showed the parks. This is the Grange Hall. This should be the blacksmith shop. This right here is what was Elder Burgess's property. We believe the hillside from where gold was discovered. And right here is the museum where the park sits today. But most importantly, here's what I got. This is an internal document, and Dr. Paul Nesbitt wrote, and he sent it in 1997 to Sugarman again. And the interesting thing about this, and I commend historians like Dr. Nesbitt, he's telling the late Matt Sugarman that the Monroe House had nothing to do with what they're doing in terms of legal record, and that the park should be telling the truth. I would agree. And he retired shortly thereafter. He retired in 1998. Unfortunately, I didn't have the opportunity to speak to him. Marilyn DeMass, in 2006, she actually reached out to the Burgess family, and she indicates that she knew where the location of the African church was in Coloma. However, the state parks had knowledge of it and requested her not to reveal the location of the site for fear of vandalism. This was sent to the Burgess family. And so I asked this question. America, are you ready for the truth? I won't read the document to you, but basically it says, one of the park historians or lead historians when we were there, before she knew that the Burgess had any claim to the land or the church, she actually was a little bit starstruck. Matthew and I's trips to HSN and Food Network and other places. Hey, she just told the truth and didn't really recognize it. But I commend her for doing it. And what it says is that, you know, in summary, it's to the best of our understanding that the African Episcopal Church is a building that is now called the Emmanuel Church. So I'd like Steve Hilton to actually comment as to why the state of California refuses to let African Americans know, the Burgess family know, Rufus Burgess know, that the Emmanuel Church was in fact the African Church. Our governor says it best. What's going on in California and America across the nation. You look, I've got 4 generations, we're the 5th, of living behind something that is not necessarily the truth. America's ready for the truth. We're ready for the truth. Let's fix this and move on. Thank you. I'll answer any questions that anybody has.
Wow, that was amazing. So I mean, we can try to just kind of do this popcorn. So who would like to start with questions?
I guess there's no questions then.
Oh, no, I'll be jumping in here in a moment. I just want to encourage other folks.
Hey, Burgess, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Hey, my friend. I just want to know what are your intentions with the museum that's going to go here as your rightful heir to the land and to correct this history?
So what I'd like to really do intention-wise is, you know, have some of the orchards restored, basically make it an inclusive place where kids can come and learn history, reinstate the orchards. And, you know, I envision, this was the Apple Hill before Apple Hill, so I envision a place where people can come and get peach cobbler, learn about what actually happened for a long period of time. And so, you know, starting with even with the schools, doing a book. And I told one of the authors, not just I don't want a fictional book, I want a factual. I want a fun factual book. And so I think we start with giving kids factual history, not the fictional, because that's where things get misconstrued. So, but we're open to ideas. Thank you so much. But I'll tell you this, and I speak for the family. The park's done a number of things with that land. There are homeowners that are there now. They had nothing to do with this. And so our intent is not to move people off the land in those custom homes that are there. I want to make that very clear right now. This is, you know, something that the state will have to, you know, remedy. If it was done correctly, we wouldn't have this issue, but the intention is not to move anybody off of land that has moved in because of something they didn't know.
That's a great answer. Thank you, and I appreciate the history for our country.
Who was the question? I guess if you are going to ask a question, if you can just introduce yourself when you do, because I didn't catch who that was from.
I'm sorry. My name is Adam Blankenship, and I'm a family friend.
Great, thank you. And where are you calling, or where are you joining us from?
I'm from El Dorado County.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Awesome.
Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you. My name's Tim Madsen. I'm actually related by marriage to the James Gallagher who you referenced in one of your earlier slides. Is it correct that did you say that you couldn't, that there weren't recorded deeds with Rufus Burgess's name on it?
No, I said, no, there are a number of deeds with Rufus Burgess's name on it. No, there are a number of deeds with his name on it. He just didn't show up on the original maps of 1873. So no, there are a number of deeds that with Rufus Burgess's name on them.
Okay, because I see them owning a piece of property which the Gallaghers later purchased from 1855, I think, to 1876.
Yeah.
And prior to that, that property is owned with Rufus Burgess and, oh, I'm sorry, I got my name wrong. That was a different side. I'm sorry, I think I may have given you some wrong information.
So I I have a quick question. So are you saying that Emmanuel Church also served as a school? Then that was also the school for children?
Yeah, well, I know that according to Maryland Demas, at the time they wanted a school for their kids. That was something in 1863 when it was commissioned. That was one of the things that was mentioned in the minutes, that they so wanted a school for the kids, because we do know that the schools were segregated at that time. So if there was any teaching mechanism, because they couldn't go to school with others, that would have been the place for them to learn. So the Emmanuel Church, the AME churches, normally just across California and other places, were the vehicle when schools were segregated.
John, this is Matt speaking. Can you elaborate on I know you went over the deeds of the church. Can you elaborate how much, I guess, Ingram purchased that church for in back taxes, with the price of the back taxes and the church, so we can get an idea how much that cost back then?
Yeah. So in 1872, well, it wasn't until 1879, George Ingram bought the church for back taxes. It was $475, which is equivalent to about $13,000 in today's money. So, quite a nice chunk of money for that timeline.
Yeah. I have a question.
This is Jennifer again. Oh, I'm sorry, Kimberly, did you have something? Go ahead.
I did have a question. Hi. I wanted just first of all to say how impressed I am with this presentation and the ability just to be able to have this history outlined. I mean, you guys are so fortunate to be able to have this history outlined, and I really enjoyed it. But my question is, how there's the discrepancies with the maps. You kind of talked about how the initial map showed, that the Burgess owning property, but then fast forward, several centuries later, it's not on there. So has that been addressed? And what is the assessor's office or anyone saying with this discrepancy with the maps and the land ownership?
So, it's a two-part question. As far as the maps are concerned, the assessor's office or surveyor's office for Elder County, they basically say that that's the only map that they have, 1873. As far as, land ownership, it is going to show what it is. I mean, the reality is that, you were given property and deeds based on where it said you were on the map. And unfortunately, other people during times had, they had alternative motives. And so really, you could be living in a place, and if they drew the map and said you lived over here, well, that's what you got paid for. And so unfortunately for the Burgess family, when it came to lot 3, block 7, which was a bigger lot, basically all of that area that I showed you on an early map, they said, no, it was an itty bitty sliver over here. And in reality, if I actually go to, I'll just show you one more slide. You can see in here, this was, the assessor's office wouldn't tell me. This was done sometime in the, I don't know if it was 40s, 50s, but you see the Methodist Church is lot 14?
Sure.
And these are question marks. These are all the orchards around the church. And so some of that had to do with time. It just wasn't safe. I mean, our grandfather, my dad, somebody could have done it, but these are questions that, yeah, they're worth asking. I think the state is in a position to where they will acknowledge something like this. So that's really what I want to bring this to light. And thanks for your question, though. Hopefully I answered it.
Yeah.
And Kimberly, did you want to share where you're joining us from?
Yeah, I'm coming from Coloma, California.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I see a question here from Regina Wilson, and she says that her connection is bad, but she's just wondering if the state parks is working with you, Jonathan and Matthew, and are they working on a way to help tell the story? And so maybe that's a question to both of you, and then I know we have some park folks on the program as well.
Yeah.
So I'll help answer or respond to that question. The state park has been working for the last 100 years, and the work that they've done has been, I would say it's been delayed. We've lost several family members waiting in the work that they've done. And at this point, they have done some things, which we are very thankful of, but for the small, minute things that they could have done as far as just which is pretty easy. Painting a picture, telling the truth is part of it, is saying that, hey, the Burgesses were landowners and they had the opportunity to do that when they put the sign in the blacksmith shop. But even then, they said that we participated or we assisted in agricultural for the Coloma Valley. And so I'm hoping that they can get a little bit better and move a little bit quicker. But that's my take on what the state has done thus far.
So Steve or anyone else from the park, do you want to say anything else about just what you might be doing with the Burgess story as well as just other African-American history at Coloma?
Jennifer, this is Tanya Burgess. And I believe I believe that Mr. Hilton is not on the call. And that's kind of representative of just the relationship that the Burgess family has had. And my brothers are being very articulate and elegant in how they're representing the information, but I come from another perspective. I come from a perspective that when we met with the parks in January of 2020, I told them time is not what we have. We've had too many descendants of the Burgess family die with this truth or this untruth being represented by the state park. So we have allies in Coloma that have assisted and helped the Burgess brothers to bring forth this information. Betty Sequest, I believe she's on here. There have been some really good, diligent people in helping, but there's also been a mirage put up as if they're still holding on to information about the Burgess family and want to send us through the normal protocol. And it's only because we went to the park and we discovered how they're just continually trying to decrease and minimize the Burgess family's representation in Coloma, which is a disparage of gut justice, as our grandfather said, and I will continue to say it. A miscarriage of justice is actually what he said, and it continues today. We are in 2020. We are in the 21st century, and no, Coloma has not done enough. It is time for change, and that's the position that I hold for the Burgess family.
Thank you, Tanya. You know, I apologize because Steve Hilton and Holly Thane were on here at one point, but I think maybe they did leave. I don't know at what point they left, but so that's unfortunate. So yeah, I'm sure there will be more as things unfold, because I didn't realize the whole story behind this church. I knew there was a connection because anyway, started hearing about it, and then when I was just looking it up over the weekend, I saw the Burgess, that Jonathan, I think maybe both of you, but I remember Jonathan was interviewed. So anyway, I could see that you guys were involved with the church, but now I'm kind of amazed to find out that the concept is this might have been then, or was the American or the African American Methodist Church, and I guess I am wondering, because you mentioned the Odd Fellows building, and I can't remember what it was, and I'm trying to clarify too if that was the Odd Fellows building in Coloma or in Placerville, and some kind of meetings that were going on there. And then I wonder if the church was there, about using the church for those meetings. So if you can just say more about those meetings, the Odd Fellows Church. And then that actually ties into my other question, just has to do with this Pacific Appeal, which is fascinating. Never heard of that newspaper. And I saw that it looked like printed maybe in San Francisco, and you said, I believe it was Burgess or one of the relatives was an agent, and whether that meant he was like a Coloma agent. So it sounds like there was maybe then agents in all different communities, but that the paper was based in San Francisco. So I'm kind of asking about different things, if you can comment on some of those.
Yeah, so like I said, in 1857, I read the Methodist minutes. In fact, it's even listed in Upton's book. It said in 1857, the Manual Church fell to disrepair. And meetings began being held in the Odd Fellows Hall, the IOOF, Odd Fellows Hall. And so that is where.
And that was Odd Fellows in Coloma.
Correct. Yep. There's one in Coloma. Yeah. And then your next question was, so the Pacific Appeal newspaper, yes, Rufus M Burgess was the agent. So he was responsible for the distribution of that paper. Not only was he the agent, he was a contributor. So it would also say like who they got letters from since the last, the last printing of the newspaper. So, part of his responsibility, yes, was the distribution for Coloma. So he was the agent for Coloma. They had an agent for Butte, a number of counties, throughout El Dorado, from San Francisco to El Dorado. So it was a pretty, elaborate newspaper for the times. And just the things they were talking about, I was actually really amazed.
And then and this is Matthew speaking. I think I want to bring up a point that's significant that would help clarify some things about the African church. Not only did the deed that we possess today say it was the African church, okay? And John alluded to this, but I just want to specify, there was internal documents that came from the state parks, which was written, I believe, from Sarah, and she said, to the best of their knowledge there at the state parks, the Emmanuel Church was and is the African church. And what I want everyone on this call to do today, once you hang up, Google African Church Coloma and see what church pops up.
Wow. So now, because the building, so obviously there's currently, a campaign to restore the building itself. The building, I guess, is actually, I think, still closed because of, whatever current status of the building. But what you just said is that it went into disrepair previously in 1857 or whenever, and that means obviously it was also used between 1857, that disrepair period, and when you guys were then meeting in the IOFF building. So somewhere along the line, the building must have had then some restoration, and it now is back in disrepair. So I don't know if you know anything more just about, what happened to the building over time.
So, according to the history, and even when the Methodists talk about when they took the building back, so they did in fact take the building in 1921 when Josephine died. And they made extensive repairs to it in 1921. And then it said that in 1928, they actually put the bronze plate on there, and they awarded, Kip and then Caleb Pierce or whoever the preacher's preacher, because things were no longer segregated. And so that's that gap that I tell you about. So what happened between 1855 or 1856 and 1921? Well, 1863 it was made the African church. Actually, but 57, it didn't fall in disrepair. The Methodists just stopped using it. And if you think about it, they really, most of the people, except for some of the immigrants, but if people were there and they didn't want to be part of, hey, we're all in church together, then they're going to go and meet in the IOFF halls, and the African Americans are going to be actually at the church. And what I find very interesting is, Coloma tells a story about the Burgesses and the Monroes. It would have been, arguing over lane that led to the colored church, and that was by an oral narrative by Cecilia Papini. Well, Cecilia Papini wasn't alive during the early days when they had the Negro Methodist Church, but if you look at the building, which I'll try and go here. So here's the church. To me, H.B. Pierce, this looks like a lane to me that would lead to the colored church. Like I said earlier, the Methodist Church, the original Methodist Church sat over here, and they never ever rebuilt it. So, with Coloma being a segregated town in the beginning, it would make sense. Well, all this up here, and even across here, was pretty much everybody on this block. There was no African Americans here. Like I said, Elder Burgess, listed as Nelson Bell, is the only one here. And I do believe this, in fact, was a hillside that he terraced across from where gold was discovered. But again, we weren't listed. He's the only African American listed on the maps, and we know that the Gooches were here and others, but nobody's listed on the 1857 map. And a lot of people by then had moved to Placerville. So again, it's just way with the times. We're lucky to have the paperwork and the documents that we have.
I know Lisa Perticchese is on with the Wapumnes tribe. She's the tribal liaison. Lisa, can you chime in and talk about what you were sharing on the chat? I'm hoping she'll unmute herself.
Yeah, and Trill, there's information that I'm sure that we don't know. I'd love to. I don't know it all. We're working off limited documents, and like Tanya said, had the park been open door, there are pictures of our family that I have not yet seen, of family members, and it's our belief that when they raised the home, every document in there came out of it, because they have pictures we don't have today of our great-grandfather, They've got aunts that I know, Ida Burgess, a number of people that I've yet to see. So it'll be very, very interesting, once the park, maybe the governor can get on them to, we'll talk to the new governor.
I just think the story of this church is, I mean, they've obviously started to, make a campaign for the church. So that's fascinating because that will, I mean, what I understand from, just reading, it sounds like there is funding. I didn't catch where it's from, but they've got at least part of the funding, like something like $2.5 million toward the $3 million or whatever it is. But then I know Steve Hilton was saying something like it maybe was a source that's now going to get held up because, of course, we're having all kinds of crazy finance things with COVID.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's a huge opportunity now with this church.
Well, there's an opportunity, and I would say if nothing else, the state's got an opportunity, and it should be a priority because of the significance of the church. But what I would say is this: is 2 years ago, about 2 years ago or a year ago, that GDPA reached out to Matthew and I because they were having a difficult time getting funding. And the interesting thing enough is that the state didn't have this on one of the buildings as a historical site that they had to preserve. That's why we had to try and get pressure to raise funding for it. So again, as I mentioned to you, Emmanuel, the word Emmanuel started in 1818 in South Carolina and always had to do with the ability of African Americans to worship Christianity. So I'm very interested to know more about H.B. Pierce because he had a number of orchards. I don't doubt these were his orchards before they fell into the Burgess family, or before Josephine married into that family. So those are some pieces that we don't have. But what I can tell you is that there were a number of parcels back behind this church that were in question mark. And those are some of the politics that we deal with today because, there are, listen, the Chalmers family made out. I mean, Robert Chalmers snuck in over here and eventually he took the church. He was set as a land grabber and they took it back and gave it to Mrs. Metcalf. And I asked, well, how did Metcalf get the property? And that's where things kind of fell awry. So it's going to be very interesting rolling out from here, but I'm excited about it.
Fantastic. I see someone joined us and I just see the name Smith. And I'm just wanted to find out, I don't know if that's Barry Smith from the park or anybody else that's just joining the call. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to share. You did just join us. And I'll just let that for a moment and say thank you for joining us, Mr. or Mrs. Smith, or Ms. Smith, or Mr. Yes, hello.
John, can you point out on this map here that you have up, can you kind of show the 1/4, 1/2 township that was given to the Monroe family? Because I think this map shows it. Could you point where that would be at?
The map that's over here?
The map that's up now, right?
Yeah, so I mean,
the homestead for the Monroes. Yeah,
the Monroes is going to be over here. The homestead, I mean, because this is all block 7. So the Monroes homestead is going to be in the black. It's not even on this side. That goes out toward Lower Main Street where Highway 49 comes in. Lower Main Street. And so the park talks about Monroe's orchards, but I know this was a heavily wooded area. I don't know that many orchards were there. I know that maybe Christmas trees and some other things. But the orchards were all, throughout here. You had orchards here and all really around the H.B. Pierce property and back along even where they say Marshall's cabin was. Number of orchards.
I want to actually, as I mentioned, Lisa from the tribe had something to share, but it sounds like her audio isn't working, so I'm just going to read this. She's saying, hi, the Wapumis tribe who has was spoken about in John Sutter's diary has experienced the same thing as the Burgess family. This is the group of Nisenan Miwok Indians that build the bark teepees and help design the front of the museum, the Indian standing at the door. Is modeled off of the indigenous tribe. The state park refuses to explain that it was the Wapumis who built the mill with John Sutter and James Marshall. The state park doesn't give the Wapumis credit for building the bark teepees and the display inside the museum. This is pervasive. So they're just saying, they're having a similar experience, with part of the history. But yeah, there does seem to be quite a lot of work to do. I mean, I know, they have a big volunteer program and all of that. And it's interesting that the Park Association did reach out to you all. So that's, hopefully going to be a bridge, but it sure seems like, do you know anything about the $2.5 million that did come to apparently toward the church project?
As far as I know, the state had allocated resources to preserve the church, and it was something like 2.5 million. There's a fund, and again, part of the deal is that this church should be a historical. I mean, it's built in 1855. It's a historical building owned by the state of California. There's no reason at all why it should not be. And now that we know it was in fact the African church, where African pioneers actually worshiped, went to school, it should and will be a priority on the governor's desk. If he doesn't hear about it after this call, he'll know about it very shortly, because there were some members from his office that will bring it to his attention. So, and again, the last slide, it has him on there. That was his quote. And hey, I think this is fitting for his quote.
Well, it's great. I mean, it's really great to have such a huge visible thing. And when I posted that on Facebook, I still didn't have this part of the story. And a lot of people on that, it's the If You Grew Up in Placerville, Facebook page that has like 11,000 followers. But there was so many people that have connections to that church. Of course, they don't necessarily know this part of the history, but it's just a connection for so many people. And that, I think it's going to be a really powerful way into the story and getting a lot of people connected to it. And of course, we're going to have Tina Alexander talking about, the church, broadly in terms of the African-American church, back in those days. And so we'll revisit this, I think, with her at some point. We haven't scheduled it yet, but I know we plan to do that. Does anybody else have questions about tonight's presentation? It was such an amazing presentation. There was so much.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
All right, this is Betty Cedarquist, and I'm just a local yokel here, but I've done a lot of research on the history over the years. And I do know that the Emmanuel Church was used by a lot of different groups back in the 1860s, 1870s. I have records of Edwin Markham, a white man poet, was married there in the 1870s. Louisa Chalmers, Alhoff Chalmers, was married there several times, twice actually, in that church. There's so much I could share. I could go on all night. But yes, I think it was used by a lot of different groups. And from what I understand, and Steve is sitting here too, he can correct me on this, that the Metcalfs did own that. It was Chalmers, well, first Martin Alhoff and then Robert Chalmers Vineyards in and around the church up until, not even sure, but it did transition to multi-fruit orchards later on, and in which you still see remnants of those poor little pear trees all around that area. The area down by the Monroes, they farm the bottomlands, very fertile lands. They terraced, certainly they terraced the right in, the Burgesses terraced all that lovely land up behind the park maintenance shop. So that was all used there. One more little factual thing, the hall, the actual physical building of the hall wasn't built until 1920, and it was then the Coloma Community Center, which later became the Coloma Grange Hall, just so you know. But yes, I think that I'm almost certain that the blacksmith shop was right on that site. It's right by they've had a number of bridges right there. They've moved up and down 20 feet, 30 feet, right in that area. But there's just a lot. And Coloma was, I think, a fairly blended community. I'm sure there was a lot of people who had very narrow views, but just from all my accounts, Steve's accounts of growing up, maybe that was more in recent years, that there was a lot of friendship and cooperation there. And so, do you want to share?
Yeah, I wanted to make a couple of comments. Matt and Jonathan, both of you know that when we first talked, I went in looking to really try to prove that your family owned that. And the problem is I ran into some things that wouldn't indicate that that's probably not the case. And looking at those records is something that really needs to be done. If you're going to really promote the fact that you believe this, I'd suggest getting somebody to do some more extensive research. Right now with COVID, I won't go back into closed buildings and look. But I did know the Metcalfs. I knew Pearlie Monroe.
Nice
and
family.
I also knew the families that restored that church in 1921. And I looked at some of the records and know a little bit about what happened in terms of them having the building. And from everything that I could see, the building was not being used by anyone when the Metcalfs essentially gave it to that group that reformed to become the Methodist church that carried it. In the 50s, I went to church there. And so the building was used from that 1921 time on through to the 50s, and then the park had it for a while, reusing things. So it's just that, boy, I wished we could find out, because if this sounds like I'm dragging my feet and don't want you to have your right things in there, that's not the case at all. But boy, heaven, what's the facts of the matter is going to be very, very tough to find, frankly.
Well, and Steve, you bring up a good point. Thanks for the comment. You said very tough to find. And like I think everybody can attest is that Coloma does a really good job from 1850, and then they pick up again, like you said, in 1920. There was a nice block of time, and as I shared with you, the deeds that we have that are original deeds from Judge Ingram and others, you cannot deny those. You look at Upton's book, you look at what actually Sarah wrote on the park herself. Now, she works at the park, Steve, not me, not you or I. And there's, listen, and I would say this, in 2006, Marilyn Demas actually said that the state parks knew the location of the side of the church and requested it not be revealed for fear of vandalism to the site. So in 2006, if you're telling me it's down where Upton said the Negro church was that had long since gone, there's nothing down there but gravel. So I would say that you're absolutely right. They made it very difficult to find. And as you know, yes, Coloma was inclusive, but there was segregation. And in 1921, there are oral narratives I care not to share on this call. We can speak offline, but there were oral narratives from my family of what went on in Hangtown and Coloma. And there's no need to talk about that because this is a new America. So with that being said, I would ask everybody to be respectful and know of the timeline. It wasn't safe.
No.
There were inclusive. In fact, I got 1919. My uncle Todd was married in the church in 1919 to my Aunt Betty, and we talk about inclusion. Well, let's look at the wedding certificate. Todd Burgess, and the wife unknown, blank. So there's no need to bring that up. We do want the truth. I've spoke with the assessor's office, and they basically said, Mr. Burgess, you can pay $100 an hour. And I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm looking for. These things have been so buried till it doesn't make sense. And yes, we went through a lot of information. And quite frankly, in 1879, 1863, they were given thousands of acres away to people. So if my great grandfather paid no money for it, he deserved it because he was tending the land. And I'll end on this note. When you look around this church, if Metcalf owned it, why are there question marks here? On lot 7, the church moved from block 7, from lot 4, block 7 to lot 14, block 7. And now we've got question marks around these vineyards.
Well, when I was at the assessor's office, I asked them about those question marks, and they actually had a reasonable explanation. And unfortunately, that's too long ago, and I don't remember exactly what it was. I could to go back again and find out because they knew what those question marks meant. The person that I talked to, I went to somebody in there, and they spent an hour with me when I showed up on the spur of the moment because they had time and were interested in finding this out. So the fact that
like I said,
cooperation is another issue in this whole thing that really bugs me.
Yeah, that's right. And it bugs me too. But like I said, Steve, Rufus M Burgess knew that nobody would believe that he actually owned a church. And so the best thing that we have is the deed when Ingram bought it, who was a tax collector, an attorney, and held as a position as a state legislator. Okay, he would not pay $475 for a sliver of land that you guys are telling me are in between the Burgess house and the Monroe house down on Lower Main Street when everybody left the town. So I can appreciate what you've done in the research, but there's got to be something more. And listen, Sarah
I'd like
spent
to
more
find
time
it.
in those archives than anybody else. And if she's gonna tell me it's Emmanuel Church was the African church, I'm believing that. And with the deeds. I didn't call it that. Ingram called it that in 1879. So
But
what other building is he referring to?
when Ingram had it, he gave it to Rufus. That deed shows that it was done for $10.
That's right. And they were giving land away for the homestead because he already earned it. They were giving land away. It doesn't matter if it's $10 or not. If you look at the people, half the people on that map weren't even in the town, but their names are listed as property
Yeah,
owners.
that's an issue too.
You had
Yeah.
Robert Chalmers, who was doing a big land grab at the time, and in probably a lot of nefarious ways. That's just who he was. But I wanted to also.
Well, Robert Chalmers didn't do it by himself, Betty. I mean, Robert Chalmers was a land grabber, but if we look throughout the state of California at the time and who the governor were, listen, Chalmers couldn't have done it by himself. There were other things that helped him do what he did.
There was some real bad stuff going on. I mean, it was really, really bad. Just a clarification, one last, and I'll shut up here. State parks, you're saying 100-year, whatever 100-year history. The monument was created, I think, in 1887. And for a long time, that was the only park. There was nothing else in the town was a park. But gearing up to the centennial, and the picture that you showed a crowd on the street, that was actually from 1948. I have the picture, 1948. And gearing up, beginning in 1940, the state park began eminent domain proceedings against the landowners of Coloma, beginning with Pearlie Monroe, and basically, pretty much stole that land, the Sutter's Mill discovery site. And then over the next 10 years, they grabbed yet more property. And even in the last 20 years, they have upped the size of the state park to its present 500 acres. A lot of the buildings were demolished at that time. I mean, so Steve and I remember many fine homes in Coloma that were destroyed by state parks. And the local people are just so upset about that these old farmhouses and historic buildings are gone. So that's, I'll end with that. The main land grab took place in the 1940s. I've seen all that documentation in the park archives. So anyway, I'll stop right there.
Betty and Steve, are you still in Coloma?
We live around the corner in downtown Lotus.
Okay, great. Just to understand. So I guess Jonathan, I wonder, there may be something that you might want to share about your conversation with Lee from the Park Service in Salt Lake City, because I think it's really neat that you connected with her, and it sounded like she has an interest in, helping to support some of this, research effort. She's a cultural resource person.
Lee definitely, as long as we're able to tie it back to the trails, Lee, there's some resources that will be available through the National Park Service was my conversation with Lee. And so we'll circle back, but it's really just about strategizing and being able to tie Coloma to the trails. And so,
okay.
But that was the conversation with him.
Okay, so just so everybody understands, we're talking about the California National Historical Trail and the connection of the Burgess family with being part of, coming over by wagon train. And so there was that connection, and they may have kind of a limited lens, but the Park Service has some other kinds of community assistance resources that that might help. There's a project or a resource called the RTCA. I think it's Recreation Trails and Conservation Assistance or something. Anyway, that's one thing, but they can probably help us find some other assistance for local history efforts. But this was just an amazing presentation, and I know we've lingered here because it's just fascinating. I just want to take a last call for, again, the recording will be shared. So, the dialogue will continue, but is there anybody else who didn't get to, ask a question from tonight?
Jennifer, this is Tanya. This is Tanya Burgess.
Hey, Tanya.
Hi. And to Mr. Cedarquest's statement about the AME Church and really being able to prove this information, I want to say that Marilyn DeMoss, she sent the email to me in 2006. And in her email, she indicated that UC Berkeley has information about the AME ministers roster that talked about the church in Coloma that was there for the education of Black children. And being that said, she was a historian, and so that is factual information, and she wouldn't have shared that information if it was not truthful. And at this point, yes, our family is moving forward with the narrative that we have. We respect the fact that the Sequests have the historical history and information about Coloma, but I would ask, did you know my mother, Bernice Burgess? She's been advocating for the Burgess family since the 70s because she knew that there were untruths that's been told by Coloma. So I just want to put that on the record because I hope that Coloma State Parks takes a listen to this, because like I said, after 170 years of going back and forth with the state park, as a person and a descendant of slaves who were pioneers in California, we have the right to have our family recognized in California as such. And
Yay.
that it's been great angst. I've seen my parents die. I've seen history die with them. My grandfather, my siblings. And at this point here, it is time for the truth to be told. And we don't want to have to go back and forth with the conversations that is it true or is it not true? At this point, I'm like, dig up Elder Burgess and let's do a DNA test, because that's how sure we are about our family's history. And Black people, all we have is narratives to go by, but we actually have documentation. So on that, I'm just gonna conclude.
Okay, you guys, I know you guys have a whole relationship and a dialogue, and I know that this dialogue is going to continue, and we're going to be revisiting it here on the Placerville History Channel as well. I just want to kind of come back because, again, I truly believe that, you know, there is something here that is of great national significance. It's a story that has meaning way beyond, you know, Coloma and El Dorado County. And that's why, you know, to me, this whole program and your story and that site, you know, meaning the state park, which is a national historical landmark, by the way, it already has national historic landmark status. But to me, it's part of a larger national park that, you know, we've started to plant the idea as a concept with California Gold Rush National Historical Park to bring a broader level of, you know, research and a broader context and a bigger picture to this whole thing. And I guess I just want to say thank you so much to the Burgess family for all the work you've done on this. This is, you know, clearly a whole part of the gold rush that hasn't been told. I mean, you know, we have a number of parks in the state park system that address aspects of, you know, the gold rush, whether it's, you know, the Empire Mine or, you know, different things, but clearly this, you know, African-American history is a critical key part. And so I just want to thank, you know, the Burgess brothers and Tanya, the whole family, and everybody else that's contributed to the dialogue. Again, we're going to have another session for sure that we've already talked about the AME Church. And, you know, again, Jonathan and Matthew, if you feel that you still, you know, want to present again, you know, later as this series continues, there will certainly be an opportunity. And again, we have this recording from tonight to share, and hopefully there will be a lot coming out of it in terms of, you know, people sharing resources and, you know, whatever documentation they have, and, you know, that we'll just all continue to work on this together. Because I mean, the fact that you're talking about an AME church in Placerville, that's going to be something that we really want to, you know, dig into in Placerville too. So it's really rich and important. So thank you so much. And if anybody else has closing comments, you know, now's the time. You know, without opening it up too much, but just kind of closing comments that anybody might want to say tonight.
Well, I'll just say, I'll start on behalf of the Burgess family. I want to thank everybody that tuned in tonight and, you know, share this. And listen, you know, we may not know it all. You know, we are limited in the research about what we have. And there's a strong oral narrative. There's a strong documented history that in the family. We know there are probably other documents that exist, but really, you know, primary documents are what we're looking for. Those oral narratives are very helpful as well. So I want to thank everybody tonight on behalf of all my siblings. I understand the passion and just wanting to know the truth. And again, you know, I think America's ready for the truth. And the fact that it was in fact used as that building, and we've got 2 documented historians that have said it, We've got a historian for the state of California for 23 years that retired 2 years prior to his 25th year, basically saying the same thing. It's really time to, let's move this forward, close this chapter, and be a more united, inclusive California.
That was a private message.
Great. Anybody else? Thank you so much, Jonathan. Anybody else, especially anybody that didn't say anything, that has closing comments? We've had. Thank you, Betty. Thank you all for attending. And I guess with that, if there's nothing else, we will adjourn for tonight. We'll be back next Thursday. We've got Dawn Basquiano saying, great presentation, thank you. I know that Bill Tweeka also was saying that church, really needs to be on the National Register of Historic Places.
Yes.
So that everybody's getting very excited about the church and, looking more at this untold aspect of the church because it's huge. So great presentation. And, thank you to John Abercrombie for joining us from South Carolina. That's just amazing. And we'll be back and the story will continue. So thank you all so much.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Great presentation. Yeah.
Fantastic presentation. And it will be available.